Thank you very much indeed. I'm, of course, very honoured to be here. I'm a bit perplexed and baffled that I'm standing here in front of you, but that's fine. I'm billed as an international political strategist, a title which anyone raging about this government while sitting in Marbella drinking a margarita could probably claim to be. But more concerningly, I've been described as a historian, and I am, I think, to history what Snoop Dogg is to madrigals. I'm a consumer of history, not really a purveyor. But anyhow, be that as it may, I stand before you with this question posed, and it's a question which I think the answer must be as obvious as, do you need milk in tea or something? Yes, of course it does, but that's a very short lecture. So, yes it does, particularly here, and particularly in those other parts of the world where Britain has impinged on their lives, which, frankly, if you look at that map of countries we haven't invaded, I think there's 3. Mongolia, and there's a couple of others, but I can't think of those. But the answer, we must embark on a bit of a journey through the sort of bridle ways and hollow ways of our past, because our story, Britain's story, dare I say even our island story, is a story rich with pragmatism, resistance, and a stubborn streak of individualism that has, I believe, long shielded us from being the tyrannies that have swept across Europe. Our history is not just a collection of dates, battles, factory acts. It's the very marrow of our identity, a living force that continues to shape who we are and how we face the world. As that titan of history, Eric Hobsbawm, once called, nations without a past are contradictions in terms. What makes a nation is the past. What justifies one nation against others is the past. To pose then the query of whether Britain's history matters is to excavate the bedrock of our collective geology, to unearth the sinews of our endurance and cast a lantern on the shadowed path ahead in a world grown perilous and opaque, in the world of the instant, of the just-in-time, the past as is relevant as it ever was, though it is too often passed over. History in these islands is always with us, though often ignored. But for us to be a happy land, we must remember that our duties are not just to those who follow us, our children, our grandchildren, but to those who came before and who created what was and can be again the finest, most peaceable and blessed polity the world has ever seen. Before we dive into this, let us pause to consider a subtle yet seismic shift in our national identity. For centuries, the concepts of Britishness and Englishness were entwined, almost synonymous, while still allowing the distinct histories of Scotland, Wales and Ireland within that broader British context. Britishness was the umbrella on which these nations coexisted, united by a shared crown and a common destiny. Yet in recent years, Englishness has begun to peel away from this union, reasserting itself as an intrinsic ethnic identity, rooted in the soil and soul of this island. This shift has not gone unnoticed or uncontested. And John McTernan, only this week, Blair's former political secretary, has called this growing reality that of an English ethnicity truly evil, which is quite strong, really, when you think about it. A phrase, I think, born of fear rather than understanding. But to grasp why Englishness is stirring anew and why it matters, we must turn, I say, to our history. It is there we find the seeds of an exceptionalism that has defied tyranny and shaped a nation unlike any other. One only has to look at what Englishness is in order to be able to prize it or indeed re-embed it into the British story. Who then are the English, the people who make up the vast majority of these islands? Kipling described it thusly, but the Englishman is like a built-up gun barrel, all one temper, though welded of many different materials, and he has a strong powers of resistance, Roman, Dane, Norman, Papist, Cromwellian, Stuart, Hollander, Hanoverian, upper class, middle class, bureaucrat, Democrat, each in turn through 1,000 years experimented on him and tried to make him in their own liking. He met them each in turn with a large, silent toleration, and which each in turn mistook for native stupidity. He gave them each in turn a fair trial, and, when he had finished with them, an equally fair dismissal. A possibly more erudite version is provided by Alan Macfarlane in his seminal Origins of English Individualism. He tells us that by the late medieval period, English society had undergone two critical and unusual transformations that distinguished it markedly from its European counterparts. What he talks of is about the very weft of our society. Firstly, the structure of the household evolved in a direction quite unlike that seen elsewhere on the continent. Intergenerational household became increasingly rare when the extended family unit lost much of its traditional coherence and cohesion. This shift occurred far earlier in England than in most other European societies, leading to a predominance of nuclear family structures. The weakening of familial constraints allowed for a greater degree of personal autonomy, particularly for women. Secondly, patterns of mobility within England were strikingly fluid. Individuals moved across the country in pursuit of employment, opportunity, or personal advancement, often relocating independently rather than as part of a familial or communal migration. This level of internal migration and resettlement was exceptional by contemporary European standards. Together, these developments created a social environment in which individual choice, especially in the sphere of marriage, was significantly enhanced. English men and women had access to a broader pool of potential partners and exercised a greater degree of agency in selecting whom they married. Their choices were increasingly shaped by personal compatibility, character, and shared aspirations, rather than by family strategy or economic obligation. Over time, this pattern of autonomous decision-making became embedded across generations. By the onset of the modern period, the English had become a society unusually shaped by individual selection and conscious self-determination. In a very real sense, they emerged as a people not merely born into a cultural tradition, but actively and continuously formed by the choices they made, perhaps more than any other population of the era. It is this stock, mixed and self-moulding, that provide the meandering banks that contain English and more largely British history. And it was in this particular character that once helped inoculate us from many of the horrors of recent centuries. In the 20th century, Europe, as we know, was a crucible of chaos. Fascism and communism raged like wildfires, consuming more unhappy nations from Spain to Russia, Italy to Germany, Norway to Greece. Britain, however, stood apart, particularly England, with its quirks and its institutions, and its history acting as a bulwark against these ideological storms. We had our own would-be tyrants, of course, Oswald Mosley and the British Union fascists, strutted about in their black shirts, dreaming of a Britain bent to their and Lord Rothermere's will, but they were undone not only by the East Enders, but by ridicule. P.G. Woodhouse's fictional Roderick Spode, leader of the laughable Black Shorts, turned their menace into mirth. It seemed the English penchant for humour is as potent a weapon as any sword. So why didn't we fall? I suggest we shift our gaze from the rise of dictatorships, too often studied at school with the zeal of a Victorian vicar chasing butterflies, and instead examine the exceptionalism that kept us free. Our history offers a lens through which to understand this resilience, our parliamentary democracy, our rule of law, our church, our fierce resistance to absolutism, the influence of Enlightenment ideas, the absence of a political vacuum in which totalitarianism can explode. Woven into this is a paradox. We favour gradual change, yet when tyranny looms, we erupt in radical upheaval, only to settle back into our steady ways. Lord Salisbury's maxim about the purpose of the Conservative Party, I think, pretty much nails it. The use of conservatism was to delay changes till they became harmless. But conservatism has failed, as it has sought instead to be the agent of moral societal change. To understand Britain's past, we must first glance across the Channel. In the 17th century, absolutism was the fashion in Europe. Louis XIV of France, ascending to his throne in 1643, ruled from Versailles with divine mandate, centralising power and sidelining nobles and assemblies. This model, steeped in Roman Catholic notions of kingship, was the antithesis of England's chaotic, collaborative spirit. Here, power was not a gift from God, but a pact amongst men, forged through centuries of negotiation and defiance. The Stuart monarchs, Charles I and James II, brought a taste of this continental absolutism to our shores, flavoured by their Catholic leanings. Charles I, reigning 1625 to 49, dissolved Parliament in 1629 and governed alone for 11 years, levying taxes like ship money without consent. James II pushed further, seeking to Catholicise England and wielding dispensing powers to bypass laws. These moves clashed with the Protestant parliamentary tradition that prized shared rule, a tradition that, as we'll see, owes much to the individualism that Macfarlane was describing. Our parliamentary system is no overnight invention, but a slow-baked creation, rising from the ashes of conflict. It began, I suppose, with the Magna Carta in 1215, where the barons strong-armed the King John into acknowledging that power was not his alone. This document, more myth than mandate, sowed the idea of governance as a collective endeavour. By the 17th century, it had matured into a system robust enough to challenge the Stuarts' ambitions. Charles I's personal rule was a gauntlet thrown at this tradition. His unilateral taxes, restrictions and arrests, like that of the 5 MPs in 1642, sparked outrage amongst the people who saw representation as their right. The Long Parliament of 1640 retaliated, igniting the Civil War, a bloody struggle to reclaim that balance, part of which took place right here, in the Battle of St. Neots. In 1648, a Cavalier defeat that led to the exile of the Duke of Buckingham and the extinguishing of the royalist support in the Midlands. James II's reign saw a similar reckoning. His 1687 Declaration of Indulgence, favouring Catholics and bypassing Parliament, prompted the Glorious Revolution of 1688. With William of Orange's arrival, James was ousted and a constitutional monarchy was cemented, all with a pragmatism that Kipling might call the English knack for muddling through. This democracy thrives on compromise, reflecting what Macfarlane identifies as a society of independent yeomen and merchants, not feudal serfs. Unlike European hierarchical orders, England's early individualism, rooted in property and personal agency, fostered a culture where power was debated, not dictated. Fairness, the quintessential English virtue, is something we can sort out for ourselves. We do not need a higher authority to tell us what is right. Hand in hand with Parliament is our rule of law, a quiet yet unyielding force. The common law, built on precedent, grew organically out of English Christianity, safeguarding liberties through a web of decisions rather than any grand charter. Habeas corpus of 1679 ensured no arbitrary detention, while judicial review curbed royal overreach. Charles I's arrest of the MPs and the trial of the 7 bishops under James defied this declaration, the bishops who defied this declaration and were acquitted by jury, proved that even kings had to bow to this system. Macfarlane argues this legal tradition reflects an individualistic society where personal rights trumped collective obedience. Unlike feudal Europe, where lords had sway, England's yeomen owned land and demanded justice, creating a legal culture that Kipling might describe as a stubbornly self-reliant nation of little men guarding their freedoms. The leveller, John Lilburne in the 1640s coined the phrase, the freeborn Englishman, as a concept that we have a birthright of equal liberties, privileges and franchises, in particular against the enclosure of common land. Hundreds of years before any sort of universal suffrage, that concept of being freeborn remained and remains strong. Our history is a litany of resistance to absolutism, both at home and abroad, most vividly with the Stuarts. Charles I's divine right pretensions, imported from Europe, met a nation wedded to shared power. The Commonwealth followed, but we then restored the monarchy under Charles II with increased limits on his power. The Catholic absolutism of James II was followed by the Glorious Revolution, which again brought in William and Mary, but with increased limits on their royal power. William was deeply disappointed because he thought he could loot the country and fight the French, and was unable to do so because of the limits put on him at the Glorious Revolution. This pattern, upheaval against tyranny, then a return to stability, echoes Kipling's view of the English as slow to anger but terrible when roused. Macfarlane adds that this stems from an individualism that rejects servitude, a trait traceable to medieval England's free peasantry. And the cycle isn't confined to the Stuarts. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw commoners storm London against taxes, but only to see it return to a level of peace very soon after. The 19th century Chartists demanded suffrage, yet their fervour pacified, and the reforms came through slowly but surely. Apart from, I think, everything was done apart from annual parliaments, if I remember rightly. But these reforms happen, but they're not revolutionary. We have this habit of conservative revolutions. We do not demand to create a perfect world. We just want our stuff back, thank you very much. And that, I think, is deeply embedded in who we are. The Enlightenment bolstered this spirit. John Locke's treatise on natural rights and rebellion underpinned the Glorious Revolution, resonating with an English ethos of liberty. These ideas sped beyond elites, fueling a culture that prized reason over dogma, a culture tied to an individualistic society unbound by those feudal chains. In the 20th century, Europe's chaos bred totalitarianism. Britain's stability, rooted in Parliament, law, and a prosperous economy, left no such gaps. Mosley's fascist and communist agitators floundered against a public that, as Kipling notes, likes its own way but distrusts grand schemes. Our island geography and naval might added a physical shield to this resilience. But at core, the English character, pragmatic, independent, fierce. This can be traced back to these small landowners who took no instruction. Well, we'll doff my cap, but only if you're worth it, only if you deserve it. There's a lovely piece in that book where, in around about 1350, Macfarlane finds evidence that the local cobbler takes the lord of the manor to court because the lord hasn't paid for his shoes. Pretty unremarkable, unless you think about it. It would cost money and effort and time for that cobbler to go to court, but he must have believed that the courts would treat him fairly. Because if he's taken the lord of the manor to court on the continent, forget it, don't even try. But he must have felt that that effort was worth going to court to get the payment of those shoes from the guy with the political power. So he must have trusted the common law in a way that no other country would have had at that time. Now, as Englishness re-emerges, distinct from Britishness, we see this individualism in Kipling's spirit resurface. McTurnan's evil label misses the point. Englishness isn't hate, but a quiet and gentle love, a heritage, reclaiming of identity within that British frame. Our history shows these identities can coexist, as they have for centuries, each enriched by the other. Does British history matter? Unequivocally, yes. It's why we were able to stand firm when Europe fell to dictators. It's a toolbox for today, a legacy of conservative rebellions and steady faith. Not mere nostalgia, it is our shield and compass. Brexit, of course, was part of this continuum. Part of the just go away and leave us with our stuff, thank you very much. Nothing particularly clever. No, do you remember this idea that people would say, well, what's it going to look like in 10 years? Response, dunno, not the point. The whole point is we then become a democracy again and it's up to the people. And if they want to vote for Jeremy Corbyn, they can. If they want to vote for somebody else, they can. We cannot tell you what it's going to look like in 10 years because you lot haven't decided yet. And it's up to you. And that was the point. One has resulted in due to the slow, deliberate death of our comprehension of history, we are beginning to look at the vacuum. If we don't know who we are, we don't know what we become. If we don't have that knowledge, it's much easier to remove our liberties if we didn't know we had them in the first place. And this failure of teaching, and failure of teaching of that growth and who we are, allows others with less kind thoughts to change the way we are and change our polity. Our past offers a political imagination rooted in real people, not abstract ideals. It is a reminder that democracy is a living practice, demanding vigilance. A pair of geniuses once put it, history is not what you thought, it is what you can remember. Embracing our history, its triumphs, ironies, errors and lessons, we ensure we remain a beacon of liberty in an uncertain world. Let's not shy away from it, but dig in, learn it, use it. For if we don't, history might well repeat, and not just the fun bits. Thank you.